Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Contours podcast series. I'm your host for today, Eugene Chausovsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Milos Majori and Andrew Loftusness about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. A more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics can be found in the weekly forecast monitor that New Lines publishes every Friday. The weekly forecast monitor examines various forecast scenarios for geopolitical hotspots around the world and the risks and opportunities that such scenarios can entail. So, Milos, it's been another very eventful week. What are some of the most important developments that you've been tracking this week?
Well, we've been seeing a lot of activity for yet another week surrounding tensions between the U.S. and Iran, which have continued to rise despite ongoing negotiations, Iran even threatening strong repercussions to a possible U.S. attack, and these tensions spreading with Israel threatening Lebanon with possible strikes against civilian infrastructure if Hezbollah acted in defense of Iran. Then shifting to the Indo-Pacific, China restricted rare earth exports to Japan, and U.S. aerospace manufacturers warned of dwindling rare earth supplies despite last year's trade truce. And speaking of trade, we will briefly cover the story of a continuation of last week, where the US has now imposed a global 10% tariff on all of its trading partners, following last week's decision by the Supreme Court that invalidated the Liberation Day tariffs, while the Trump administration opened an investigation into an accident on the coast of Cuba, which resulted in the deaths of 4 Cubans. And then finally, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy expressed optimism in upcoming trilateral negotiations with Russia and the US in March, while the US held talks with Ukraine on post-conflict reconstruction.
Got it. Thanks, Milos. So let's start off this week, as we have in recent weeks, with the Middle East, and particularly the situation with the US and Iran. And I should note that we are recording this podcast on Thursday morning, February 26th. So things are moving very fast as usual. But let's start off, Andrew, first with a situation both diplomatically and what we've been seeing militarily out of this hotspot over the past week.
Right. So in addition to Iran itself, of course, all eyes are currently on Geneva, where as we, at the time of recording, actually, U.S. and Iranian diplomats are meeting for the third round of indirect negotiations in recent days. The last I saw, and I checked just before we started recording, is that both parties had returned to the table about half an hour ago. So I just want to note for listeners that it is possible that there could be significant updates, either diplomatically or otherwise, more on that in just a moment, within a few hours from now. Now, that being said, we do have the first updates on a couple of critical details from what the U.S. negotiating team is pushing for. Specifically, the U.S. is insisting that the Iranians completely dismantle its 3 main nuclear sites, those being Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, and then after that deliver all enriched uranium to the United States. This is a very recent update, so no direct response, at least publicly, yet from the Iranians on those demands. Now, there have been some very interesting comments from senior Iranian negotiators, basically saying that if the U.S. only insists on a nuclear deal, right, and not support to Iranian proxies throughout the Middle East, or Iran's conventional weapons programs, in particular its ballistic missile programs, then a deal is very much possible. Now, at least publicly, including as recently as yesterday, both the U.S. Vice President and the Secretary of State have made comments that if Iran will not negotiate on its ballistic missile programs and its support to its proxy network across the Middle East, then that will be a significant challenge for the success of the negotiations. Right now, we don't know if the U.S. is sticking to that line or not. So I'm certain we'll have some updates there in short order. Turning towards Iran itself now, the U.S. is continuing its significant military buildup near Iranian shores, and really just a posturing of all of its forces in the Middle East for the potential, the event of an operation potentially a sustained operation against Iran. The Iranians, for their part, have said that even a limited operation from the U.S. would, quote, be met with a ferocious response, which I have no doubt is true, that they intend to retaliate in a significant way. That rhetoric, of course, itself, though, is nothing unusual. Another important note inside of Iran is that student protests have resumed across Iranian university campuses starting on February 21st. Most universities in Iran remain closed right now, of course, in the aftermath of the mass protest movement that we saw in January and the very violent government response towards those protest movements. This is the first time that protesters have been gathering in numbers since January. There were clashes between these students and IRGC security forces. I say this with a large degree of caution, but from what early reports indicate, it does seem that the Iranian government's response has been limited in comparison to its suppression of those protests in January, according to early reports. Again, that is something that could change quickly, really at any given moment. And again, just like in January, it is very likely that the looming threat of rapid military intervention from the United States and, of course, Iran's own hopes for success at the negotiating table are limiting their domestic security precautions right now.
Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, it looks like a lot of activity happening both on the security side, as you've mentioned, in terms of internally within Iran, and on that continued U.S. military buildup. But we are seeing some parallel diplomatic activity that could potentially stave off a U.S. operation, or at least impact the extent of it. Of course, we've seen a number of different regional players responding and trying to shape the unfolding events. The Gulf countries in particular, states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, these are countries that would be significantly impacted in the event of an Iranian response, whether that be against energy facilities or against the Strait of Hormuz. And so they have been, playing an important diplomatic role, but clearly a lot of actors are preparing for at least some level of military activity out of the U.S. that could happen, as soon as within the next few days or so. So we'll be paying very close attention to that. And in the meantime, we have been seeing some neighboring theaters, see some significant activity as a result, particularly when it comes to Israel and Lebanon. So what can you update us on that front?
Yeah, so a key diplomatic and security concern, of course, of all of the U.S.'s main partners in the Middle East would be a regional fallout from any war between the United States and Iran. Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah is probably the primary example of that right now. So the latest is that Israeli officials have warned the Lebanese government that it will strike civilian infrastructure in Lebanon, including Beirut's international airport, if Hezbollah should attack Israel in the event of a war between the United States and Iran. The potential for significant destabilization inside Lebanon right now is very high. That's the case even without this looming threat of war between Iran and the United States, which would almost inevitably immediately involve Israel as well. We've been talking about the disarmament efforts from the U.S. and the Lebanese government towards Hezbollah right now. Again, in the event of a U.S. attack against Iran, depending on the severity of that and what the U.S. was trying to achieve, of course, would have a massive impact, or is likely to have a massive impact on any response from Hezbollah. The last thing I'll note there, just because there is quite a bit we could talk about, is that regime collapse inside Iran would, of course, be an existential threat to Hezbollah itself. So again, the severity of any reaction from any of those parties will likely depend on exactly what the U.S. tries to achieve inside Iran, assuming that President Trump does give that order.
Right. And I should note that this is coming, amid continued military activity out of Israel, not only in Lebanon, but also in places like Gaza and the West Bank. So we'll be paying very close attention to any potential for military escalation on those fronts. And then finally, just to kind of wrap up on the Iran story here, there was a notable development related to China and its cooperation with Iran from this past week. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, so what we understand right now is that the Iranians are very close to closing an arm deal with the Chinese, which would have Iran acquire advanced anti-ship missiles, which obviously it could use to threaten the United States forces in the region. Now, obviously, that matters. That's significant. Depending on what type of weapon systems we're talking about specifically, that could definitely have an operational impact on the choices that the U.S. makes. It almost certainly won't have a strategic level deterrence factor, however. But bigger picture, and again, to stick with this theme of regional and global fallout from any sort of U.S.-Iranian military confrontation, is what the Chinese and the Russians would then do in response, not just to a limited U.S. attack in Iran, but in the very, I would say, realistic possibility of a sustained campaign from the United States.
Got it. And speaking of China, let's now pivot to our second global hotspot of the Indo-Pacific, and we're going to incorporate some global trade developments here as well. So turning back to you here, Milos, what can you update us on the U.S. trade front, and particularly as it relates to China?
Right, well, zooming out just for a second and picking up from where we left off last week, as the news of the invalidation by the Supreme Court of the Liberation Day tariffs came just after we finished recording last episode, so we'll pick up from there. But essentially, the Supreme Court's decision invalidated all tariffs that were put under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which basically the Trump administration used last year in order to impose tariffs of varying degrees across all of its global trading partners, something that we've covered extensively since then. Now, since last Friday, we've gotten quite a reaction from the administration, none too pleased, if I say so myself. Initially, Trump did threaten to place a flat tariff of around 15% on all of the US's trading partners. But since then, that's been downgraded to 10%. So he signed this via executive order, invoking Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act. Now, I should note that this is one of the legal mechanisms that the executive branch obviously has for imposing tariffs, but without congressional approval, these tariffs are set to expire within 150 days, and that is as of this week. We did also get news from the U.S. Trade Representative, Jameson Greer, that his office would be continuing to perform investigations under Section 301, specifically, as you mentioned, involving China, but also Brazil. And I should notice that China and Brazil are some of the countries that actually have benefited from the Supreme Court's decision, as both of the tariffs on their exports have reduced considerably. Now, looking at some of the other trading partners, I can cite the European Union, which obviously has been quite angry about the resulting situation, as under the previously enacted trade deal, we saw that a large number of goods had been exempted from the 15% tariffs that the US had against the EU, whereas now all of the goods are, have this flat 10% tariff. So at the moment, we're seeing pushback from the European circles with calls to possibly halt the ratification in the European Parliament until the situation is fully clear. Turning now to China, as I mentioned, this is quite beneficial from Beijing's point of view. Their tariffs have fallen considerably, although there's a number of tariffs still in place on more sectoral sections, including on aluminium and steel imports. Beijing itself has stated that it was closely monitoring any subsequent US policies on trade following the ruling. And I should say that the court's decision may make it harder for the Trump administration in future negotiations. And we got confirmation from the White House this week that President Trump is actually going to be following up with a visit to China at the end of March, early April. And trade is bound to be at the top of the agenda. And of course, without the lever of those tariffs, it's difficult to know how exactly the US may put pressure on China. And it could be that Iran is involved, bringing it back to the story you mentioned, Andrew. The fact that China is cooperating with Iran, especially in this overt way, on military cooperation could be something that the US uses as a potential lever in negotiations. But for now, it seems that the world is waiting to see how the United States reacts and continues on its foreign and trade policy. But it looks like tariffs in some form or another are likely to stay.
Got it. Thanks, Milos. And speaking of trade volatility, we've been seeing some very notable and significant developments between China and Japan this week. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, well, China actually followed through this week with something it had announced last month, and that is to implement an export ban, specifically on dual-use rare earth materials to Japan. So this involves 20 goods, which includes not only sort of the raw or processed rare earth elements, but also advanced manufacturing equipment, machine tools, as well as magnetic materials and battery-related materials. It's further added another 20 materials on a watch list, which doesn't ban them outright, but significantly slows down the trade. And this, of course, relates back to the fact that Japan made those comments back in October, I believe it was, indicating that a potential attack on Taiwan could directly lead to Japan's involvement, coupled with the fact that the Japanese Prime Minister won a legislative election recently. And, there's been rumors of her putting the self-defense forces reform back on the agenda. I reckon this is a potential reaction to that. And I should say that it's not just Japan that's been afflicted by the rare earth situation. Bringing it back to what I was saying about the United States, despite the fact that there is a trade truce with the United States, particularly with regards to export controls and export bans of rare earths, we've gotten a lot of news from the United States aerospace and semiconductor sector warning that the rare earth supplies haven't really picked back up despite the agreements, placed last October. So combined, these two stories combined, and we know that the Japanese Prime Minister is a strong ally of President Trump. This could also be something that comes up again at the end of March with the upcoming summit. So we'll be sticking around to find out.
Got it. So lots to pay attention to there from a hybrid escalation standpoint. And now shifting a little bit towards more security level activities, we've been seeing some notable developments out of Australia and Taiwan. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, the main news was just that the Australian Navy conducted a freedom of navigation operation, essentially sailing a frigate through the Taiwan Strait. That in itself is not hugely notable, although Australia doesn't usually perform these on the same level of frequency as the United States does. And we've been seeing, over the course of the last year, an increase not only of US Navy assets going through the Taiwan Strait, but also some of the European allies, including France and the United Kingdom, Canada as well. Australia has been positioning itself recently of late back within the United States security sphere, making agreements on potentially allowing increased access of US forces of various Australian ports for its navy, as well as its submarine fleet. So definitely just the latest element of a story that we're definitely keeping an eye on, that is Australia's involvement within the sector.
Understood. So let's shift now to our final global hotspot, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So turning back to you here, Andrew, what can you update us in terms of diplomatic developments from this past week?
So just like with Iran, we will start in Geneva, where today as well, the U.S. and Ukraine are hosting the latest round of bilateral negotiations. There's likely a number of topics of discussion on the table. We understand that today there's a particular focus on post-war reconstruction efforts inside Ukraine. Now, when listeners hear that, they may very well be wondering, is that a bit premature given where we're at in the timeline in terms of implementation? Yes, there's no question. When I see that, though, I think that the Ukrainians are watching how Trump and Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who I need to know are also leading U.S. diplomatic efforts in Ukraine as well, are handling diplomacy in Gaza and between Israel and Hamas. And there's no question that Trump and Jared Kushner in particular are very eager to begin reconstruction efforts inside of Gaza. So while it's, of course, not really possible for progress to be made in reconstruction inside Ukraine right now, I do think that the Ukrainians are trying to use this to diplomatically posture themselves for greater leverage and just goodwill from the United States over some of these main security points, which of course, as ever, are the future control of Donbass and the Zaporizhia region. Zelenskyy had an interesting comment following this latest round of meetings. He said that he thinks a trilateral meeting between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia will take place in March. He said that Trump supports this initiative. The two presidents did speak on the phone today. And then very interestingly, Zelenskyy noted that he thinks if that trilateral meeting takes place in March, that could pave the way for a meeting between himself, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump, which of course has been something that President Trump has had his eye on for quite some time.
Got it. And in the meantime, are there any notable military or hybrid updates that you wanted to brief from this past week?
Definitely. So again, when we're talking about diplomatic headlines, the actual situation on the ground and in Ukrainian cities is as intense as it has ever been. Zelenskyy did note in his nightly address in Ukraine that Ukrainian forces have reclaimed 800 square kilometers of territory from Russian forces in the southeast of Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine will no doubt try to leverage that as soon as possible at the negotiating table. On the hybrid side of things, there was recently a sabotage operation that Russian intelligence conducted inside the Ukrainian city of Lviv, where an IED was detonated, killing at least one person and injuring 25. I do think that there is potential for hybrid escalation inside Ukraine and inside Russia as both parties try to gain, of course, leverage at the negotiating table in whatever way is possible for them at the time.
Got it. So we'll have to leave it there. Before we wrap up, Miloš, were there any quick hits that you wanted to mention elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring attention to some of the developments closer to America. So specifically Mexico, the news this week was that of violence which erupted across multiple regions of the country following the killing of the leader of the Jalisco New Generation cartel, who's known as El Mencho. More than 70 people have died during his capture by security forces, and following his death as a result, cartel members attacked multiple infrastructure sites, including an airport in Jalisco, with intervention by armed forces, resulting in the death of 25 members of the Mexican National Guard and 30 suspected members of the cartel. Now, the cartel has warned of further violence, and we know that he had quite a strong grip on the organization, and the power vacuum that's in place now may beget more violence in the weeks to come. So we're keeping an eye on that. And then just drawing attention to the latest possible escalation on the Cuban front, with the Cuban Coast Guard opening fire against a US-registered speedboat that entered its territorial waters, as a result killing 4 of the 10 passengers. The individuals on the boat were Cuban nationals in exile with previous criminal history, and the Trump administration denies any involvement or knowledge of the incident, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio stating that the US would be conducting its own independent investigation before commenting any further. So we'll be catching up with that likely in the weeks to come as well.
Got it. Thanks. So we'll have to leave it there. If you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates and analysis around the world. Thank you, Miloš. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.